I'm Holly Stave from the Scholars College, and this is an evening session on big ideas, and the idea for tonight is power. This is the second in a series. The first was on love, which I believe was around Valentine's Day. So I guess all of you know pretty much where my theoretical interests lie, and so it's probably no big surprise that this is going to be on Foucault. If there is one word that the French social theorist Michel Foucault is associated with, it is power. Like everyone else who does this kind of work, you hear power, you think Foucault. It's like the cat, or the dog and bell ringing or whatever. But Foucault transformed how many people understand that term, and he liked to contrast it with what he called domination. That, in a dictionary, those might be seen as synonyms, but Foucault insisted that they were not. Because for Foucault, power presupposes a degree of freedom. Think of what the word actually means. Powerful muscle means you can do something. Power presupposes freedom, whereas domination does not. And so that although he goes on at great length about how power works subtly throughout our social life, he insisted that it can be productive as well as constraining. And that, I would argue, is very important right now. So Foucault maintains that power is everywhere, but it's diffused and it's embodied in discourse. But he says power makes us who we are, since our routine behavior, the things we do every day, are driven by our hegemonic understanding of ourselves. And because it is hegemonic, we don't necessarily get up in the morning and look in the mirror, and I don't look at and say, I am Holly Stave, I am a woman, I am a feminist, I am a Wiccan priestess, I am a professor. That's who I am, but I don't necessarily go through the litany of that. But in identifying myself with those things, that determines a lot of what I do, what I say, how I dress, the way I have decorated my home, the people I choose to friend with. I don't consciously think of that. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But that's how power, my authority, myself, how I have constructed myself. Foucault also believes that knowledge is always an exercise of power, and power is always a function of knowledge, and I think that's really important. And if you think of history here, a lot of people don't know, for example, that there were African slaves on this continent before the Mayflower landed. That there were slaves in the Jamestown colony, and they were black slaves. So, how would knowing that change the way Americans think about the idea of this being a white country, which it isn't? But how would knowing that change that? How did the, at one time, presumed knowledge that marijuana was a dangerous drug lead to the just absolute obscene incarceration rates that we have now? And now we have this strange situation where state by state marijuana use is being legalized while there are some people serving life sentences for it. But at one point, the power structure insisted that there was knowledge that demonstrated that marijuana was dangerous, and all of those who insisted it wasn't were not heard. And now those voices are being heard, but we've got that situation we're in now. I think a good example that you all remember, those of you in scholars from TNT2, is Galileo, who knew he had a more accurate understanding of the solar system, but he was terrified when he was shown the instruments of the Spanish Inquisition, and he relented because knowledge in his time was that everything revolved around the earth. And so if you didn't believe that, you were a heretic. But it also is just like you were challenging what was knowledge, and of course knowledge becomes truth, becomes power. So the Galileo example, I think, is a good one because, I was looking at something that I can never get his name right, Neil deGrasse, was posting about the number of Americans who don't believe all these major scientific ideas, and only 1 in 4 Americans actually believe that the Earth revolves around the sun. You know, so think about that, what that means in terms of the looming environmental crisis. You know, what knowledge is and isn't. So, for those of you who had TNT4, you know that the way this power works is through what he calls biopower. And it's that every detail of our life is recorded somewhere. I was thinking about this because when I taught the Civil War in DV, you know, one of the things I was aware of, we didn't go over it much in class, but there were, I mean, not a lot, but there were women who cut their hair, put on men's clothes, and went and fought in the Civil War beside their husbands. And how that would be so impossible now because you are screened and every detail of your anatomy is recorded, and you know, there's no way, I mean, now the women can serve in combat, but there's no way you could disguise yourself, you women, as a man and join, because everything is known about you. You know, we know, are we above average weight at birth? How did we do on every standardized test we've ever taken? How many times were we absent in 7th grade? What illnesses have we had? All that stuff is known about us, and the list goes on and on. But I think too of how anxiety producing it is when we fail in some way. What happened, the stress parents feel, for example, if they have a 2-year-old who doesn't talk yet. But yet anyone who's known multiple sets of parents knows that there's some 2-year-olds that don't feel like talking. There's nothing wrong with them. They just don't have anything to say. And, but the anxiety, something's wrong, you know, drag the child to this speech therapist and that speech therapist because people are saying something's wrong. I think of, well, I'll give some examples from people I know. So on the one hand, we've got this power that controls everything we do and records everything, but of course there's also the power of resistance. So that's where I'm going to focus later this. You know, what happens when a suburban homeowner understands the destructive ecological impact of too many lawns and returns her massive front lawn to the prairie it once was? That a friend of mine in Milwaukee did that. Why is there such cultural anxiety created by trans people who simply point out that their sex and their gender don't align? And we all know people for whom that is true. Why are some parents so upset when their offspring tattoo their bodies or pierce their tongues? But then, you know, there is resistance. My friend turned her lawn into a prairie in spite of the homeowners in the neighborhood going ballistic. We do know men and women who tattoo their bodies and pierce their tongues in spite of what their parents say. And we have often joined with our trans brothers and sisters to fight for their rights. So you see how, on the one hand, there's a societal norm that says that's not right. You know, the people that still idiotically believe there are 2 biological sexes, all evidence, scientific notwithstanding. And then there's the resistance that pushes back. So you see how power circulates. So that brings me to where we are now in the days following an election, which many people believe will usher in an era of racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia that many of us thought might have been safely relegated to the past. But I think it's interesting to look at the way power circulated in the last few months. Now, since I had a husband who was glued to the TV since July of 2015, watching every, I have to say for one, I'm glad he's back to watching movies where things blow up. But watching every little nuance of that, you know, at first the whole thing was Trump is just a buffoon, this is like reality TV comedy, you know, what an idiot, you know, the relief when he was the GOP candidate because, you know, he's such a buffoon. But then the news media, to keep its viewers, kept giving him publicity, which was their form of power. I don't know that they were, their power, they wanted economic power. They wanted people watching Fox or MSNBC or CNN. So they gave him more and more coverage. And I think a simple thing to ask is if they had spent as much time giving Bernie Sanders the coverage they did Donald Trump, what might be different now? So they exerted their power, and that then started changing how people were seeing him, and it gave the people who were the initial deplorables other people joining them that maybe weren't so deplorable. But then the tape came out from the bus, and women from the GOP joined forces with other women to say this is unacceptable. This man speaks about women in a way we don't want our daughters to even hear. So again, the winds shifted. And then the power of women united, feminists together, was evident there. But then Comey dropped the bomb about the non-existent new emails, which weren't even written by Hillary, and that was his power play, and it shifted. And Trump won the election. But there are now demonstrations, massive demonstrations in 12 major cities, and evidence that Trump has not won the popular vote. So we're a very divided country, but I guess I try to take hope from that the idea that, anyone I know who's Muslim is going to be deported, that Chris Das Neves is going to be deported because he's not a citizen, immediate funding for all health care, is going to be, all the things I worry about, I think might not happen because of the way power circulates. So what goes on from here? Trump will have the Senate and the House on his side if you just look at numbers, but many of the GOP don't like him at all. So there's power, he has power and he doesn't have power in Washington for that reason. So he's trying to stock his administration with like-minded people to grab power back. But the counter movements are also strategizing and using power to resist his power. So in the past few days, women who are required to, whose birth control has been paid for by the Affordable Care Act are being encouraged, if they can't afford birth control, are encouraged to in the next few months get an IUD because it'll last for 5 years, and hopefully by that time this mess will all be over. People are encouraged, trans people are encouraged to get passports just in case. And lawyers I know are giving pro bono work to help trans people get documentation in their correct gender, with social security numbers in the right name instead of the dead name. Lawyers are also working to get undocumented immigrants through the system faster, because it's also very expensive. My hairdresser's wife was Vietnamese, and who said the night of the election, "Do I have to buy a plane ticket now?" But they have spent $14,000 already, and she's not a citizen, with immigrant, or what do you call it, the kind of attorneys who specialize in immigration law. It's not an easy process, and the courts are back way, way, way up. In Minneapolis a few years ago, they were back 10 years up. So when you filed your plea to become a citizen, it would take you 10 years to get through the process. So some lawyers are working to speed that process up. There's getting to be a network of people who will agree to house undocumented immigrants in their homes, and there are cities like Seattle and Providence who are now saying, regardless of what the law is, we will not name anyone, we will not deport anyone. So, they're making themselves safe zones. So I've been babbling longer than my 10 minutes, I believe, but I think that at a time when so many people are shaken, we have to remember that power doesn't just work this way. It works this way. And that's where we have to take our hope, and there has to be political resistance. We have to be able to join together to do what's morally right. And yeah, there are consequences for that, and I'm not saying that, that's always gonna be a teddy bear's picnic, but that's what we have to do. But that's where at least I, for one, am getting a great deal of hope, because the other word Foucault is associated with is freedom. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Stave, for presenting, and our next presentation will come from our student, Caleb Howell.
I feel the spitting. I'm going to read from The Ethics of Ambiguity from Simone de Beauvoir, and then follow it up with some thoughts of my own. So, man's unhappiness, says Descartes, is due to his having first been a child, and indeed the unfortunate choices which most men make can only be explained by the fact that they have been taken on the basis of childhood. The child's situation is characterized by his finding himself cast into a universe which he has not helped to establish, which has been fashioned without him, and which appears to him as an absolute to which he can only submit. In his eyes, human inventions, words, customs, and values are given facts. as inevitable as the sky and the trees. This means that the world in which he lives is a serious world, since the characteristic of the spirit of seriousness is to consider values as ready-made things. That does not mean that the child himself is serious. On the contrary, he is allowed to play, to expend his existence freely. Of the child. He can do with impunity whatever he likes. He knows that nothing can ever happen through him. Everything is already given. His acts engage nothing, not even himself. The fact is that it is very rare for the infantile world to maintain itself beyond adolescence. From childhood on, flaws begin to be revealed in it. With astonishment, revolt, and disrespect, the child little by little asks himself, why must I act this way? What good is it? And what will happen if I act in another way? He discovers his subjectivity, he discovers that of others as he approaches adolescence. It is not without great confusion that the adolescent finds himself cast into a world which is no longer ready-made, which is to be made. He is abandoned, unjustified, the prey of a freedom that is no longer chained up to anything. Cool. We've evolved to a point where there's no need to make the world ready. Privileged people inherit financial stability, educational opportunities, the privilege of their parents, perhaps their respective identities. What if some people never reach adolescence, as de Beauvoir defines it? What if these people hold political power, as if they could not with such privilege, as if they could not with the best education and few or no financial limitations? There's no instance of double consciousness, no need to form multiple selves for public and private spheres. Cisgender people have no need to pass, straight people have no need to assimilate or to withhold identities. White people have no need to appear less menacing. Privileged and oppressed, the two are not comparable. Alongside oppression is a need to gauge the necessity, and I do mean necessity, either to form a self that will be accepted or to buckle under and to live in marginalization. What is power? I'm getting there. In physics, power is the measure of work over time. Work is a push or pull on an object which causes the object to move. Mathematically, power is greatest as infinitely large pushes and pulls they act incessantly. Humanity, or I call it meat in physics, is the force and the forced. It is of no consequence to the forcer that the underserved are moved, and so too are oppressors, callous to those who are pushed. In this way, the greatest measure of power is pure complacency. Complacency begs ignorance, particularly normalized active ignorance. The very people inundated with privilege and opportunity are recalcitrant to embrace adolescence and responsibility, as de Beauvoir defines it. It is by remaining a child that we escape the great fear of humanity, free will and responsibility. Infantilism and complacency breed childlike selfishness and stunts empathy and recognition of the other. There are no children's games in adulthood, however, whether one recognizes one's age or not. It is only through participating in oppression and complacency in one's timeless, ageless, inherited infantile identity, never newly formed, never adolescent, that we trivialize the suffering of others. We make judgments about marginalized people from places of privilege, deeming human rights of particular people comparable to gun control and taxation. Perhaps we can see past the veil of privilege and complacency to better understand the agendas of the other. We desire the agency to exert equal and opposite forces, and with equal power, the original forcer will begin to notice greater and greater difficulty in their push. Do not shy away or lament as you feel the push you exert. Understand your presence and deny complacency. This is the equalization of power.
So thank you, Caleb, for presenting. Our third and final presentation will come from Dr. Peace.
I have to admit, when Meg asked me to do this and gave me an hour, I was delighted, and then she came back and took back 50 minutes of my time, said 10 minutes, and I thought, how on earth can I talk about power in 10 minutes? It takes me that long to just do an introduction. I come at this question, with this issue, from a very different perspective than our previous two speakers. I'm an economist, and I'm also a political editor. And so I'm going to look at the flow of power, how presidential administrations get power and what limits that power. But I also have to admit, I come at this from a theoretical perspective as an economist. And the great strength of my discipline is also its weakness. We tend to be highly reductive. We form models that are parsimonious. We consider that beautiful, but we also leave out a great deal of reality in the process. And we treat people as agents who are able to act in ways that in real life we know they don't. We treat them as rational, we treat them as well-informed. And if our politics has shown anything, it's that people are neither rational nor well-informed. So these models that we use, while they're extremely powerful on a small scale, break down rather quickly when we try to apply them nationwide. So even though I come at this as an economist, I'm also thinking in terms of, as a political editor and a scholar of Soviet government. I want to talk about where presidential power comes from, what limits it. Our presidency is by nature a fairly weak office. The Constitution gives the president very little power except as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And yet the presidency has grown to be much more than that. And the question is why? How has presidential power expanded so much? Well, there are multiple reasons. One of them is that there are occasional vacuums of power, and the presidency will expand to fill those vacuums. For instance, when Congress refuses to act on something, for instance, immigration reform, it leaves an opportunity for the president to step in and fill that gap. We have the issuance of executive orders. Some people are extremely upset with President Obama over his number of executive orders. However, every president has issued executive orders. A lot of them are simply housekeeping orders. Every time the Thanksgiving turkey is pardoned, that's an executive order. When the White House china was replaced, it was by executive order. Most of these executive orders are fairly unimportant. Others, like changes in immigration law, are politically much more contentious. They're much more important. How is it that the president can step in and change immigration law? The Constitution doesn't give the president the power to pass law. It doesn't give the president the power to change law. And yet, the executive branch now is responsible for more law than the legislature. We currently have over 1 million regulations on the federal books. If I had the set of volumes that simply describes those regulations, it would stand a yay tall. Just the one paragraph descriptions. That's a vast amount of legislation that has never gone through Congress. Why have presidents been able to do that? Why has the executive branch done that? Well, we developed something called administrative agencies in the early part of the 20th century. These include things like the IRS, the EPA, OSHA, the Interstate Trucking Commission, a variety of agencies that issue regulation. They act not only as the legislators, they create the regulation, it goes into the Federal Register, and after a certain period of time, if Congress hasn't chosen to block it, it becomes federal law. They create the law, then they administer the law, they enforce the law. They take all the functions of government into one agency. And you might ask, how can that be? Is that not counter to the Constitution? Well, yes, clearly it is. But the Supreme Court has ruled this constitutional. The reason is that after decades of doing this, the power became so entrenched that it was practically impossible to disentrench it. The courts decided on the side of practicality. We can't get rid of the administrative agencies, therefore they are constitutional, and they reasoned them into constitutionality. So this is an example of power growing to fill in vacuums. We needed things done. The executive could do them more efficiently, could do them more quickly than Congress could. We've had, in the expansion of executive orders, though, an illustration of the limits of power. The president can do a lot of things by executive order. When we're enforcing particular laws, the executive can decide what parts of the law to focus on. We can't enforce the entire law. The law is vast, it's complex, and the administration has to pick and choose where it's going to exert its efforts. So when President Obama decided to limit the scope of the government's action on immigration, that was actually a reasonable thing to do. We couldn't enforce the entire thing. He chose to emphasize resources in one place. The problem with that is that of all the things President Trump will be able to do, the easiest are to undo the things that the previous president has done by executive action. So he can step in and he can, with a stroke of a pen, undo every executive order that President Obama issued. Can he undo the law? No. Can he undo Supreme Court opinions, decisions? No. I had friends who were highly concerned about same-sex marriage during the campaign. My brother is married to a delightful man from Mexico, and they had a double concern. Would the marriage be valid, and is there going to be a deportation? Well, his husband was able to get citizenship before current state of affairs. They were able to get a good immigration lawyer. I don't know if they spent $14,000. They spent a horrific amount of money, got him his citizenship. They're set, but then the concern was the marriage. And I told him, Stephen, look, don't worry about it. There's nothing here to worry about. And he said, of course I'm worried about it. Trump and Pence are promising to do something about same-sex marriage. And I said, Stephen, don't worry about it. And Trump has since said, I'm not going to deal with this, it's settled law. Why is it settled law? Well, the Supreme Court ruled. The president can't undo the Supreme Court. And they settled it in a very comprehensive way. Obergefell did not legalize some same-sex marriage and not other, as happened with Roe v. Wade in the case of abortion. Same-sex marriage is legal. It's on the same status as every other marriage. So this became settled law. There is practically nothing a President Trump can do about it, and he's recognized that as power has begun pushing back. As Dr. Stave pointed out, he's got a Republican Congress, he's got a Republican Senate, he's got a Republican House. But these are people with their own agenda, and their agendas don't match his agenda. They don't march in lockstep. So, as we saw when President Obama came into office, he had large majorities in both the House and Senate. And they worked with him on the Affordable Care Act. But he had a number of other priorities that he fought for that he could not get through Congress. And it wasn't because Republicans were obstructionist, it was because he didn't have all the Democrats on board. Presidents do not have the power to force Congress to do much of anything. The growth of the executive branch seems almost inexorable over the last century. The public has demanded that the president take more power. There's a relationship between power and fear. As we learn when we look at the Great Terror. The Great Terror was a tool, and Stalin was psychotic, yes, but the Great Terror was actually a tool that allowed him to overcome institutional inertia, that allowed him to break down log jams that would prevent him from getting things he wanted done. Fear was a way of breaking that log jam. The Great Terror caused people to give up power. Now, it's false to believe that in the Soviet Union, Stalin had all the power. It was far from it. But by the appropriate use of fear, he was able to accumulate a great deal of power that he hadn't had. Fear has actually provided a great deal of power to American presidents. Consider what happened after 9/11 and the passage of various acts like the Patriot Act. It was because people were afraid that they were willing to give the executive the power to do what it did. Well, the legislature handed over that power. The Defense Authorization Act that gave the president the authorization to hold people indefinitely if there were concerns about terrorist activity, if there were a national security threat. The creation of the FISA courts. All of these things We have voluntarily handed over to the executive. And now if we're afraid that a President Trump has access to these tools, it's because we put those tools in the hands of the executive a long time ago. I think it was foolish to believe that we would always have presidents that we considered our kind of president, whatever our kind of president was. I'm much more conservative. I would have been perfectly happy with a President Jeb Bush or a Rand Paul. They're conservative. Well, Jeb, centrist. Rand Paul, conservative. I like that. But I had no concern about a president like that having the powers that the modern executive has. The biggest power that the president has is the power of precedent. Things that have come before can come again. They become normalized. As we normalize various elements of our government, then we come to expect that they will be passed on. And as we want things done more quickly, if we want more power in the courts, if we want more power in the executive because they can move quickly, they're happy to take it, while the legislature backs away and avoids exercising power because they would rather have the perks of power without the actual exercise of it, in my opinion, partly because individually they have very little power in the first place. So as an institution, they're willing to give up power to others who are more willing to use it. So the power of precedent, I think, is my biggest concern with the way power is exercised in the United States. As it's exercised, if we agree to it, then it becomes okay. We agreed to the administrative agencies, and they became okay. We've agreed to a lot of things that have become okay. And if we don't want them to be okay, then again, echoing something Dr. Stave said, that has to come from the bottom up. Ultimately, power in this country does come from the bottom up. We tend to think in terms of oligarchies and in terms of conspiracies. We're a very conspiracy-minded people sometimes. But if we think in those terms, those are fearful terms that cause us to abandon power. So if you're afraid you can't have power, you can only exercise power if, well, you can be afraid and have power. Fear is not the problem. Being controlled by the fear is the problem. Letting the fear restrict your ability to act is the problem. So, recognizing that you're afraid and then acting anyway, well, that's a definition of courage. Courage is a form of power. Now, my time is undoubtedly up, and I'm only about 5 lines into my notes here. Typical for me. I can talk for unlimited amounts of time on a single page of notes. So I'm not going to get to talk about other sources of power, and I don't get to talk about diffusion of power via other systems in our economy. So if you want to know about that, come by my office sometime and ask, and I will be happy to keep you for an hour. People who come to my office now oftentimes find they have to set their clocks, because if they don't, I'll keep them until we're both exhausted. And on that note, thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank everyone for coming tonight. Look out for our 3rd installment of Big Ideas coming up next semester. The theme is TBA, but once again, can we get a round of applause for our 3 presenters?